Planning at Becker and is based in Wellington. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a very hard session, as we all know, the after-lunch session. But based on the vibe that we've had so far, I don't think there'll be anyone falling asleep, or I hope not. If you do, please do that quietly. So I'd like to introduce the panel here this afternoon. We've got, first of all, on my left, Dr. Stephen Goldson, the Director of Better Border Biosecurity. Ray Wood, a Principal Scientist with GNS Science. Professor Les Oxley, Professor of Economics at University of Waikato. Al Morrison, the CEO of the Department of Conservation. Chris Mace, Chair of NIWA. And finally, at the end, Professor Paul Dalziel, Professor of Economics, who has stood in for Dr. Grant Edwards, who couldn't make it due to snowfall in Christchurch. The purpose of this session is to focus on how we use and manage our resources. We're focused on the sustainability of our environment. Our local and global environments face challenges never seen before. Of course, this means we need to find environmental management solutions that we've never used before. I mean real solutions, not the small, disconnected decisions we wrap into processes like we do in the RMA, but step change solutions that address our real land use issues, resource use and environmental challenges. We must start by focusing on delivering real and connected outcomes. So here we are in New Zealand, a country which is as physically remote as it's possible to be from the rest of the world. Our native flora and fauna has evolved because of our long-term disconnection from other parts of the world. It's a great story, of course, but here and now at this conference we're focused on how do we improve our connection to the world. And yet our history as people is one of connection. From the day that James Cook arrived here to today, there have been two people connected, sometimes well and sometimes not so well, living in this environment. So as we talk about how to connect our economy to the world to achieve a more prosperous future, we must also talk about our connection to the environment. To illustrate the point, many of us were captured by a movie that emerged from James Cameron's imagination a few years ago called Avatar. It was a movie about an interconnected ecosystem on a planet far, far away. That movie was a box office sensation. Why? Well, maybe because people feel disconnected from their environment and wanted to believe in a more connected world. My question is, why must we imagine that that exists on a planet far away? It exists right here. Māori know that, but we all need to start seeing our environment and the many ecosystems it contains as a connected system that it is. Then we must start to act in a way that shows we understand it's connected. So science can help us to understand these connections, but then we must act on delivering that step change. But that step change must focus on ensuring that we are the last generation to leave this place in worse condition than we found it. It's taken many centuries to degrade our environment, and it will continue, and it will take many centuries to improve it, at the same time as supporting our economy to prosper. But our aspiration from here on must be for every generation to leave behind a better environment. Easy to say, but hard to do. But New Zealanders understand that our environment underpins our economy. Our future is connected to our environment. In order to look forward, I want to take you back. Some of you not that long ago, but for others a bit further back, to your childhood. The inquisitorial nature of children is something that we've all experienced. The fantastic thing about kids is they're full of questions that sometimes we find a challenge to answer. So I get, Dad, how do trees grow? Why do plants make flowers and people don't? Natural environment that we are all guilty of taking for granted. These questions come from a sense of wonder about the world. The more questions we answer, the greater the level of inquisitiveness we encourage. It's a wonderful cycle. So to stick with the inner child, I'm going to take you on a roller coaster ride through our environmental record. Some good, some bad, but all of it providing opportunity for the leaders of today to deliver the children of tomorrow a better environment. New Zealand is a country with significant natural resources on land. However, over centuries of human endeavour, we have lost forest cover, wetlands and many natural areas. Today we deal with the consequences of this history constantly. The loss of natural wildlife habitat, increased flooding and topsoil erosion, to name a few. Let's just think about topsoil for a moment, or dirt. We all had a wee taste of it as kids, I'm sure. I'm from Taranaki and it tastes pretty good up there, I can tell you. But back then I had no idea how important it was, this dirt. It's just something to walk over, play rugby on or traipse through the house. But the top 15 centimetres of soil underpins approximately 20% of New Zealand's economy. Do we treat it this way? Do we acknowledge the trade-offs we make when our cities expand over this precious brown resource, or when poor land use practices send more of it washing down rivers? A recent report by MFE estimates that the cost of hill country erosion to New Zealand is between $100 and $150 million each year. How do these decisions affect our future ability to provide food for the world? Well, we know that science has played and will continue to play a huge role in how we manage land resources and how we feed the ever-increasing human population. Turning to oceans, as an island nation, we respect our oceans, but do we really understand our impacts on them? I find it fascinating that an island country in the middle of an ocean on the edge of the world, we're only now putting in place legislation to deal with our EEZ. I am sure we would have some debate about that today. New Zealand's marine environment is 14 times greater than its land area. Again, MFE estimates that 30% of that marine environment is thought to experience some degree of disturbance from human activity. Talk to anyone over the age of 60 and they'll tell you that we've lost a lot of fish from our oceans. They remember them being there when they were swimming at the beach as kids. We rely on our marine environment. 99% of our exports are transported by sea, and marine industries contribute around 3% to GDP. That 3% could grow if things like aquaculture or increased mineral and oil exploration occur in the marine area. But whatever we choose to do as a country, we can't get this wrong, and science must inform policymakers and decision takers. The good news is we're also world leaders at marine reserves. Currently, just over 3% of New Zealand's coastline is protected by marine reserves, and that makes us a leader in the OECD. But we all know that's not enough, so what's our step change? Unfortunately, we're also a world leader when it comes to extinction. Having lost almost half of our native bird species, the majority of our native forest cover, and 90% of our wetlands, it seems we've little to be proud of. However, we are world leaders in conservation and restoration. We all know about a third of New Zealand is legally protected for conservation, but perhaps more important are the stories of the many public and private initiatives to improve our conservation outcomes. As an example, we're pioneers when it comes to offshore island restoration, predator-proof fences, and restoring populations of endangered species from a very low number of individuals, like the kakapo and the little black robin. Can science help us deliver a step change and deliver on the big vision of a pest-free New Zealand? The survival and then the revival of our fauna depends on it. Finally, on freshwater, in terms of our water quality, New Zealand has a mixed reputation. When compared internationally, freshwater in New Zealand is both clean and in plentiful supply. But we don't want to be compared internationally, we want to be admired internationally. 100% pure relies on images of the Southern Alps and glacier-fed rivers. But if you throw on a pair of gumboots and stroll around some of the streams and rivers that run through our agricultural catchments, the image is quite different. Almost all small shallow lakes and agricultural areas have poor water quality, and it's a similar story for our many precious groundwater resources. Although this paints a pretty grim picture, there is opportunity here. There are great initiatives underway, all underpinned by science, technology, and a shared interest in the future of the environment. All of these lessons we will learn, and we will learn them well, and we will take them to the world as the aspirational example of how to grow an economy and restore an environment using shared values. So looking to the future, to deliver a better future, we must look back to understand this is a long-term problem. The last few days we've been struck by history, here in Gisborne where the future of our two connected cultures began. I started this session with some examples of questions that children pose to us so that they can better understand the world around them. I'd like to wrap up with some questions that we as adults should be asking our children. What sort of environment do you want to inherit? What trade-offs do you think we should make in order to leave behind a better environment and a better future for you? Do you think sustainable management is a good idea? Try explaining that to an 8-year-old, it's pretty challenging. And are we really doing it justice? What opportunities do you want when you grow up to work here in New Zealand? To sum up, because the environment is so interconnected, it seems that we think it's too hard. Yes, our history is confronting, but we don't lack the desire to make a difference. New Zealanders are passionate about the environment and they understand its importance to the economy. And we excel and we always win against the odds in whatever sphere we choose to work. So let us use the power of science and a Māori worldview of the interconnected world and collaborative decision-making to drive major step change in how we manage our environment. We face difficult choices, but they must be made. We can and must continue to use resources, perhaps some we haven't used before. Also, we can and must choose to protect things that we haven't in the past. Again, it's easy to say, but it's hard to do. But we love hard in this country. That's why we love living out here on the edge. And my aspiration is to ensure that we are now the first generation to leave behind a better environment than the one we inherited. I'd like to hand over now to Professor Les Oxley. Thank you.
Okay, well, I've been charged with trying to say how science can be used to help us manage and use resources, and it's a pretty easy one for me to start talking about. I'm an economist, and economic science can actually contribute a huge amount to our understanding about how we use and manage resources. I agree with what was being said this morning about the fact that we need more investment in research and development. We need a lot more research and development spend on economics as a science. But that's not the way that I'm going to promulgate what I'm going to talk about today. First thing I'm going to grasp with is this notion of being an economist. And people have alluded to this a little bit this morning. What's happened to my... That's the way I see myself. Okay? For those of you in the back who can't see it, that's what I see. What's happened to it? Gone again? What? Backwards, okay. That's the way most of you see me. For those of you who don't know who that is, that's Hellboy. And the good thing about Hellboy is he's a reformed person from the underworld. And he spends his enormous power, notice the prosthetic arm that he has there, in saving the world. And I don't care whether you see me as the first picture or the second picture, whether you see me as evil or whatever. I think that there is a lot to be said about how economists can help deal with using and managing resources. I have no problems with technology being the source of economic development. It's been the source of economic development since people have been ploughing fields, and the Industrial Revolution was based upon technology. That's not the issue. The issue is, in some sense, how we use technology to further our economic well-being. What do economists do? Well, we heard from Caroline Saunders what she thinks economists do, and we heard a little bit from Sir Peter about what he thinks economists do. But economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources between alternative and competing ends. The first thing is about allocation. And when you think about economics, you think that all economists think that allocation is about markets. It's not all about markets. Economists can give you all sorts of different allocation mechanisms. The fact that we've had markets long before we've had economists shows that markets are incredibly successful at allocating resources. But if you want permits, and you want tradable permits, and you want quotas, we can look at some of the incentives that are created by that. Economists, believe it or not, understand that resources are scarce. It's a fundamental part of our discipline that we understand that resources are scarce. And I'll ask you a question, and I normally expect a little bit of feedback from the audience. So if I don't get it, I'll just guess what you would have said to me. Who's heard of peak oil? Okay? It's a real problem, isn't it? Who's heard of peak coal? Peak coal, we've got one at the back there. Peak coal was something that Stanley Jevons talked about in 1865. He was worried about the dependency on coke for steam engines. Peak coal was solved when the price of coal quadrupled in the UK. We now have more than 1,000 times more coal underground in the UK than we ever extracted from the UK. Peak coal disappeared. It disappeared because of technological change and the development of oil and the internal combustion engine. Who knows what was the biggest problem that the founders of electricity had when they were trying to roll out electricity? They were scared that they didn't have enough copper for cables. The response was, there was a resource searching for copper and for recycling. That issue disappeared once the technology had found that there were reasons to develop new resources. Some of these were markets, some of these were quotas. Now, I have one small problem with Sir Paul's vision, and it's the notion of and, which I think some of you thought was quite a good idea. And this is because one basic issue that economists teach from Econ 101 is the problem of opportunity cost. So when I say to you right now, what did it cost you to get here today? Now, I guess some of you will say $250 because I flew in from Wellington. Some of you might say, you know, a little bit of oil and my carbon footprint was high. Opportunity cost for economists is what you don't do when you choose a particular action. It's the next best thing that you would do to the one that you're doing. So the opportunity cost of my time is my time of being here. That's what it's costing me. So when you're choosing one thing, you're ruling out a whole bunch of other things that you don't choose to do. And that's the problem with the and. And that's the problem with thinking that you can invest in science and technology and healthcare and other things. There will be consequences of those actions, those choices that are made. Who's got a cell phone? Why have you got a cell phone? Who made you buy it? What do you do with it? Some of you might have seen me play this game before, so don't spoil it if you have. Most people say it's a wonderful tool. It is a great tool. It's a computer in your pocket. And you can contact everybody anywhere in the world. The world is tiny. Okay, in the last 2 weeks, how many of you phoned Chile? How many of you texted someone in Helsinki? Got one over there. Good one. How many of you contacted someone in Singapore? Okay, how many in the last 2 weeks phoned someone in New Zealand? How many of you phoned someone in the city that you work? How many of you phoned your colleagues? The reality is that most of this technology is incredibly locally used. Even though it has this great capacity to be used elsewhere, it's not used elsewhere. Who's read the book, The World is Flat? Who bought the book, The World is Flat? Oh, dear me, you know, you wasted a huge amount of money. The world is not flat. What we know is the world is incredibly spiky. And that's a serious issue, and it goes back to Sean's point this morning, that innovation occurs in cities. People want to live in cities. People are moving to cities. And that is not something that we are dictating is happening, it's what is happening. And that's an issue to do with New Zealand and how we move forward. I've been given the time and my time out, and I just want to give you a couple of things here. As an economist, I'm going to be really a heretic here and say GDP is not fit for purpose. I don't like GDP. It's not fit for purpose. It was designed to deal with World War II financing problems. It wasn't to deal with sustainability. We're 33rd in the world in terms of GDP per capita. We're number 3 in the world in terms of the Human Development Index. We're number 6 in the world in terms of Gallup poll's measure of happiness. And we're at the bottom of the league table in terms of environmental footprint. Choose which of those metrics you want to move forward. But if you're choosing GDP, you're starting from a long way back. And if you want to be like Australia, then that's what you need. The truck is physical capital, the little person is human capital. New Zealanders have decided that they don't want to be like Australia. And if you're trying to catch up in terms of GDP, you need that. If you're not prepared to have that, then get away from this notion that that is your vision and your target for the future. And we need to spend much more of our money understanding how the New Zealand economy works before we start looking at exemplars around the world. We know more about Israel than we know about New Zealand. That's ridiculous. So I think we need more high-quality New Zealand economic research. We need deeper New Zealand economic research, and we need that research to inform scientists and for scientists to inform us as a group. So it's a dialogue issue, but it's also more and deeper research about the country that we actually live in. Thank you.
Good afternoon and kia ora. My name's Stephen Goldson. I'm an entomologist and an applied ecologist who has over the years developed an interest in biosecurity. I think the question being posed at this event around the future of New Zealand and the role of science has been well rehearsed, so I won't go through that again. But I will applaud the Chair's comments and the previous speaker's comments, which coincide with what I have to say. I will say a few words about the defence of New Zealand, the defence of its ecosystems, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges in doing this and the optimistic role that science may have in helping. So we're a trading nation and we're going to continue to be. We're a tourist destination and we're going to continue to be. The corollary of that is that we're going to have a lot of stuff coming over the border, and in the last 20 years the volume of tourists and containers has doubled. We can't avoid it. But with this is the biosecurity threat, with this is the prospect of the invasion of New Zealand of all kinds of pests and diseases. The damage from these species will occur and can occur in all ecosystems and make a serious impact, which will probably get worse as a result of climate change. The list of actual and potential invaders to this country is long and full of nasty surprises. Some of the many examples that resonate or may resonate are varroa mite, weasels, potato psyllid, clover root weevil, PSA and kiwi fruit, gorse, painted apple moth, possums, foot and mouth disease, didymo, rabbits, mosquitoes and fruit flies. Pests and diseases like these, and believe me, there are many, many more, can both wreck the productive and native ecosystems of this country if we don't keep them out. These are the ecosystems that New Zealand's prosperity depends on, and these are the ecosystems that makes New Zealand different. So the question is, well, why us? Why are we so biosecurity conscious? Why are we so at risk? Ecologically, New Zealand is almost unique in the world, and using Simon Upton's words of some 10 or 20 years ago, we are the last bus stop on the planet. Until 700 years ago, when people started to arrive with their various accompanying species and pests and plants, New Zealand's landmass had been unsullied for about 80 million years without mammals more or less doing its own thing, while the plants and animals that were here 80 million years ago continued to adapt. Birds, reptiles and insects evolved to fill the spaces that mammals have inhabited in other countries and in other parts of the world. Many of the bird species became flightless and a bit dopey. The splendid isolation that New Zealand had for all that time resulted in an array of unique ecosystems pretty much unlike anywhere else in the world. And for example, 95% of our insect species in New Zealand are found only in New Zealand. None of the species in Britain are found only in Britain. It's a huge difference. So if Britain loses all its insect species, there's no loss to international biodiversity. If we do, it's a catastrophe. The responsibilities we have are very high. So having New Zealand plants and animals having developed in the absence of a wide range of sharp-toothed invaders, were wide open to invasion, disruption and extinction. And for example, since the arrival of vertebrate predators, 40% of this landmass's bird species have disappeared. Now that's the natural ecosystem. It's not well set up to defend itself. It has a lot of species in it, but it's not very good at dealing with those invaders that come from far more competitive ecosystems all around the world. The situation of productive ecosystems is also challenging, but for completely different reasons. Productive ecosystems, the problem is there's not enough species. Productive ecosystems in New Zealand are transplants, partial transplants of bits of European and other countries' ecosystems. So apple trees arrived, ryegrass and clover arrived, but not the biodiversity in which those things evolved. So the result is we have hugely simplified ecosystems. So when invasive plants and animals arrive in these ecosystems, they frequently encounter a year-round supply of sometimes thousands of hectares of highly suitable food, plants, unfilled niches, and a lack of effective natural enemies and competitors. This means that invaders often establish, thrive and build up to devastating populations far greater than found in the original ecosystems. So what happened in the 19th century, where many of these if you like, crop plants and economic plants were brought over. They were brought over on sailing ships. It took 6 months or 3 months. They set off with quite a lot of problems, pests and diseases. They died on the trip. So the plants, the valuable plants, arrived without the burden of pests and diseases that are found where they came from. And New Zealand's had a pretty good run because we have had and have still a pretty unproblematic ecosystem in terms of pests and diseases. But the party's over. We have huge ships now, huge amounts of freight going very, very fast from lots of different places. This is the threat, and that lack of pests and diseases is the problem that is the thing that we must maintain, and that's where the science must come into it. The situation is not stable. The Ministry of Primary Industries is facing very, very severe challenges in its border biosecurity. Every year there's 600,000 sea containers arriving. Now ideally we inspect every one of those. Now that takes about a day each. A crew of 5 or 6 checking every twig in it, every stick in it, every lawnmower in it, or whatever's arriving here. And somehow 600,000 sea containers have to be dealt with. Every year, as it is, MPI, the Ministry for Primary Industries, intercepts 4,000 to 5,000 invertebrates at the border. And at the moment, there are 3,000 identified global insect crop pest invaders hanging around waiting to get in. As if this is not enough, as a trading nation, we have an obligation not to muck around. The flow of trade can't be inhibited. Sea containers can't be held up. There's no room to hold them up. And if we hold them up too long, then there's a WTO issue that we're not playing fair and that we're messing around with trade. So somehow this country's got to deal with this stuff in order to preserve its uniqueness. Scientific research just has to be part of the solution. We can't intensify the management of what we're doing anymore. The human capital potentials cannot be exploited any further. There's only so much you can do with a rubber torch in a tightly packed sea container. And really that method hasn't changed since about 1890. So technologies must be researched, science must be used, technologies must be designed and above all adapted from technologies being used elsewhere. Then the work we need to do needs to be about things like data handling, risk management, pathway risk assessment, automated inspection methods, molecular methods for on-the-spot species identification, forensic techniques for determining pest origins, remote and non-remote surveillance, socially acceptable containment and socially acceptable eradication technologies. And the eradication process is difficult. It's much harder to get rid of invasives than people believe, and the aerial spraying of Auckland was the last heroic effort to do that. And when we talk about socially acceptable technologies, there's further work to be done. Science has to address this. So biosecurity is not just nice to have in this country. It's absolutely essential to New Zealand's future, and only through science working very closely with biosecurity officials in the Ministry for Primary Industries and others is there the prospect of this country keeping up with its biosecurity demands. Please note that science-informed biosecurity is about protecting the very systems and industries that other science can add value to. Such defensive work is fundamental. It's not the sort of work you can put a precise value on. Funders and decision makers must understand this. The environment of this country is what makes it outstanding. It's also that which makes it uniquely vulnerable to biosecurity failure. These considerations are so much part of New Zealand's future. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Next, we've got Ray Wood from GNS. And just after Ray, we're going to break and take a couple of questions just to try and break the session up. We've got a very large and very capable panel. We want to try and get some questions in just to keep you involved. So if I could get a few of you to think of some questions for our first three speakers and come to the microphone as Ray finishes. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon. It is a real pleasure to speak here today. I'm a marine geophysicist. I want to try and give you maybe a bit different perspective on some of the issues and opportunities that New Zealand has in terms of its resources. Most New Zealanders think of themselves as residents of a small, isolated island nation. A handful of islands tossed across the vast expanse of the Southwest Pacific. This could not be farther from the truth. In fact, New Zealand is a vast continent, 96% of which is underwater. The islands of New Zealand cover an area of about 250,000 square kilometers, but the territorial sea and EEZ, the extended continental shelf, and New Zealand's responsibilities in the Ross Sea together cover an area of more than 7 million square kilometers, something approaching Australia in size. Few people realize this today, but in the future it will be obvious that New Zealand doesn't stop at the coastline, but extends from Antarctica to the subtropics, from virtually just off Bondi Beach to halfway to South America. So what does this mean? For one thing, it means that New Zealand probably has continental scale resources and continental scale responsibilities. I say probably because I will discuss in a moment, we know very little about much of our offshore area. But if we can find them and develop them, then these resources could be economy changing in scale. From the few data we have, we think that about a quarter of the EEZ is underlain by sedimentary basins that might contain oil and gas. If those basins are similar to Taranaki Basin, then the in-ground value of the resource could be worth something over $1 trillion. We know there are large deposits of gas hydrates. This is methane that is trapped in sediments on the continental slope. Some of the largest of these deposits are along the east coast of the North Island, not very far from where we are today. If those could be developed, then they could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. We know there are large areas of phosphate and manganese nodules that could be worth tens of billions of dollars. We know there are hydrothermal mineral deposits along the Kermadec Arc, north of New Zealand. The world's giant volcanogenic massive sulfide deposits formed in similar geological environments. And if there's a giant deposit along the Kermadec Arc, it could be worth tens of billions of dollars. Iron sand deposits along the west coast of the North Island may be worth a similar amount of money. But the point is not really I'm trying to make is not that it's 10 billion or 100 billion or $1 trillion. That's not the important thing. The important message is New Zealand has a diverse range of resources that are likely to be large enough that we need to know more about them. Now, I'm a geologist. I'm not qualified to talk about living resources, but I'm also sure that exploration of our marine territory will find exotic forms of life and unique ecosystems. And we're almost certain to discover other resources that we can't even think about today. But as I mentioned earlier, with continental scale resources come continental scale responsibilities. Now, some people may disagree, but I think that the Resource Management Act actually does a reasonable job of managing onshore development. But it is only a success because it is backed up by comprehensive knowledge of things like the topography, the vegetation, soils, geology, climate, things like that. Hundreds of scientists have spent their entire careers walking over mountains, through forests, down rivers, mapping what they saw and deriving an understanding of the environment and the resources of New Zealand. The problem is we have no similar framework to guide decisions in the offshore. What if New Zealand was discovered today rather than 1,000 years ago? Given what we know about biology, geology, and ecology, do you think New Zealand would look the same? Would the largest city be built on a field of volcanoes? Would the capital be built on a major tectonic fault line? Would the major sources of renewable energy be remote from the major energy users? Would the moas be extinct and the kauri forest largely gone? I mean, this may seem like a foolish question, but I think in fact it is highly relevant. Because as I started my talk, what I'm really saying is that we are only now discovering New Zealand, the 96% of New Zealand that is underwater. Most of New Zealand is under the ocean, but only about 3% of our GDP comes from marine activities. There are many reasons for this, but a significant barrier to development, I believe, is the lack of knowledge. We have an adequate knowledge of the shape of the sea floor for less than a third of the EEZ. And these data tell something about the nature of the sea floor as well, that is, whether it's hard or soft, sand, mud, or rock, and so on. And this is information we can use to infer something about submarine environments. In other areas, the bathymetry data are often tens or even hundreds of kilometers apart. And in these areas, we rely on satellite data to tell us the shape of the sea floor. Since their release in the 1980s, these data have revolutionized marine science. But although they can point to a submarine mountain, they cannot provide sufficient detail about the shape or nature of the seafloor to support either resource management or development decisions. We know quite a lot about the geology of the few areas where oil and gas and mineral exploration has occurred already, but very little elsewhere. In many areas, these data, like the bathymetry data, are often tens or even hundreds of kilometers apart. This situation is true, in fact, for almost all the data that we need to manage our offshore territory. Now, why do we have so little data? At least in part, it's because we have a very large marine territory. And the other part is that collecting data is very expensive. An example, a boat suitable for collecting scientific data typically costs $50,000 to $150,000 a day. Now, so far, New Zealand is fortunate in that this dearth of information hasn't been a major problem. But this is only because there are relatively few users of ocean resources, and there's been relatively little competition for ocean space. One measure of the use of ocean space could be the size of an activity's footprint on the sea floor. The fishing industry is one of the largest users of New Zealand's ocean resources. It employs about 10,000 people and earns more than $1.3 billion per year in exports. Bottom trawling is estimated to affect about 8% of the EEZ. And benthic protection areas, that's areas that are banned, where trawling is banned, cover about 30% of the EEZ. So that's almost 40% of the EEZ is one way or another has been affected by fishing. The mining and petroleum industry employs about 7,000 people and earns about $2 billion per year in exports. Petroleum exploration permits cover about 6% of the EEZ, and mineral exploration permits about 3% of the EEZ. And we know that the interest in the ocean is only going to increase. Aquaculture, wind energy, tidal energy, wave energy, oil and gas, phosphate, massive sulfides, iron sands, gold, biological materials, marine parks, tourism, biopharmaceuticals. The list goes on. The challenge is to maximize the long-term economic and social benefits from New Zealand's marine estate through informed management of our resources. If there's anything our onshore experience tells us, it is it won't be easy. The management decisions we make now will affect the future of the offshore and the future of New Zealand. I believe we have a window of opportunity to gather information while demands for ocean resources are relatively low. We have the chance to make informed decisions about what parts of the offshore will be the equivalents of parks, of farms, of forests, of cities, of mines. And informed management will only be possible if we improve our knowledge of the offshore. And this will only happen if we increase our investment in gathering information in the offshore. In that, the government has a role to play. The government needs to invest in science, in surveys, and technology, and most importantly, it needs to encourage industry to do likewise. If we plan ahead, if we invest in knowledge and find out where the fault lines in the kauri forests are, then I believe we shouldn't make the same mistakes again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ray. So the microphones are open. If people want to come and ask a couple of questions, that'd be great. Thank you.
G'day. My name is Mark Lucina. I'm an engineer, occasional academic and sustainability enthusiast. I guess if we're talking about politically incorrect, then statements like what Les said about GDP has got to be top of the list, the idea that GDP is not useful or even dangerous as a metric for national success. And another panel member was pumping his fist as Les was talking, and Derek Handley said the same thing this morning. So I'd just like to ask the room who agrees with this idea that GDP is probably something we'll kick out, and that we should be looking at alternates. It's a decent number, isn't it? Well, I'd just like to suggest that that could be a tangible outcome for this conference, is actually taking it a bit further, because if you listen to politicians or read the columnists in the newspapers, you get a completely different idea. So maybe that's something we could do something about.
The issue is GDP is good at doing what GDP was built for. It was built for dealing with financing World War II. If we're looking at issues of sustainability and we're looking at issues of well-being, then it's not well designed to do that. So I'm not knocking GDP as a concept. I'm knocking the use of GDP as a single measure, single metric of success. And one thing I didn't have time to talk about was, why are Kiwis going to Australia? They're going to Australia ostensibly because real wages are higher there. But real wages are higher there because Australians have different values about what they're prepared to do to attain economic growth, which Kiwis who stay at home aren't prepared to accept. And the problem is that if you use GDP as a measure to try and keep Kiwis here, when they're more interested in other measures of well-being, then you're sort of creating the wrong sorts of incentives for the wrong sort of metric. So I am an economist. I have a lot of time for GDP used appropriately, but it's a very simple measure that has been captured by scientists, by politicians, by many, to be used for all sorts of different reasons. So it's horses for courses. That's what it's really about.
Stephen.
Can I just make a very simple comment? I don't care how you measure the economic performance of New Zealand. If we've damaged the setup and the ecosystem so badly, it doesn't matter. It's not how you... We've got to maintain the capacity to generate whatever it is we need, irrespective of how you measure it.
Right, Natalie Plank's got a question for us, and she's going to explain where it's come from. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks. So most of you hopefully know that we're running an online game called Punamo at the moment behind the scenes. So we have some people who are not able to be here at the forum. And I bring a question from this online game, mostly looking at how we are using our resources and things. So one thing that's coming up is, why don't we grow our population to 10 million people?
Okay, it's a great question. I'm going to throw it to... I'm going to throw it to anyone on the panel, and then we'll move on to the next group of people. Please.
I'll pick that one if you like, because I sort of intimated that cities were part of a New Zealand future. And one thing that you find when you talk to New Zealand businesses, and I've spoken to many over the last few years, is that the size of their local market is a real inhibitor to them developing products that they can then sell overseas. And I'm going to be, again, quite controversial here, that in some sense, New Zealand without a larger Auckland is a very difficult model for me to understand. And that is about planning. That is about issues to do with property prices in Auckland. Auckland ratepayers aren't going to vote to open up the North Shore. But that's where, you know, that's the sensible place to be developing. We have a motorway to nowhere. And really, you should be thinking about the South Shore rather than thinking about the North Shore as the future for that sort of development. A few years ago, I might have talked about Christchurch. That would have been a real bad mistake in terms of another place to be developing. But we're stuck with Auckland. It's topologically, it's a disaster. But in many other ways, it's the only place where we can develop that number, whether it's 10 million, whether it's 4 million, whether it's 6 million.
We love Auckland here, don't we? I'm from Wellington, I should say, and we all need Auckland to prosper, don't we, as a country? And the population debate's an interesting one, and one that I'm not sure that we've ever really had as a country. I know Australia's been having it in the last couple of years, and you wonder, I know, just as a comment, that back in the 80s when the deregulation occurred, we focused a lot then on the productivity of our agricultural sector, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in this next session, but we have never really focused on the productivity of our cities. And our cities are ecosystems in themselves, and they need good infrastructure, they need good productivity. So that's something that we should focus on. The population debate is a part of that. So I'll take one last question, so I didn't see you there, and we'll move on to the next panel.
Steve Thompson from the McDiarmid Institute, following up on what you were just saying, actually. The Brundtland Commission of several years ago now had several very good ideas, and one slightly nutty idea. It described the economy, the social sphere, and the environment as three separate but slightly intersecting circles, and the middle was supposed to be sustainable development. I actually challenge that and suggest that an economic system cannot exist except within a social system, and a social system can't exist except within an environmental system. Within that context, can I ask probably Les and any other aspiring economists on the panel there, what do you think about the long-term possibilities of not a goods tax, but a bads tax? A tax on pollution rather than a tax on income, this sort of thing. So we tax all the things we are trying to get rid of and don't tax all the things we like.
economists can give you a tax for anything, so long as you identify exactly what you're trying to achieve. And the problem with putting taxes on is that you often don't do enough work to identify the incentives and the disincentives that are being created. And I'm going to take a slightly different answer to your tax one that came out of the debate over lunch. And this was this issue about food, and we haven't got enough food. Part of the reason why we got a food crisis a few years ago was the idea that we should be getting more and more biodiesel. We created this huge linear sort of brain, whatever you want to call it, that suggested that we could have both biodiesel and food. And it was the most stupid thing ever. But most economists had already predicted that. Because we'd worked out what the incentives were going to be created in terms of land clearances and all the rest of it. So this is sort of roundabout way of answering your question. We can create a tax to create all sorts of outcomes, so long as you're very careful about modeling how those outcomes will spill over into areas that you don't linearly think will have an effect. We can also subsidize as well as tax.
Thanks, Les. I noticed that economists are always very good at pointing out what they get right after they said it. Thanks, Les. That's great. I agree. It's an interesting challenge. Al Morrison, Department of Conservation, next. Thanks.
Ha tēnā koutou katoa. New Zealand's banknotes. Each one features a native bird. I won't test you on the $100 one, but can you remember what's on the $10 one? Did you get it right? It's the whio, the native blue duck. The whio's threatened. Currently there are only 4,000 to 5,000 birds remaining, and the Department of Conservation developed a recovery plan for the duck, but we couldn't afford to implement it all. Then in March, Genesis Energy stumped up with the $2.5 million to complete the work in partnership with DOC. Why would an electricity company spend that much on conservation work it isn't required to do, and as much again on publicising the work? Genesis CEO Albert Brantley put it this way: we well understand that the presence of whio and breeding pairs in the stream is a great indication of the health of the river. If we can demonstrate that whio are thriving downstream of our operations, it says that we're doing a great job for the environment. In April, Air New Zealand and the Department of Conservation signed a partnership with $1 million a year to DOC. It includes pest control around the Great Walks to make the experience even better. That's work extra to what DOC can afford to do on its own. Air New Zealand CEO Rob Fyfe said the partnership will see our two organisations come together to enhance and promote the sort of things that make New Zealand unique. These are just two recent examples from many existing and developing conservation partnerships between DOC and business. The leading edge of business in New Zealand is linking its bottom line to the state of our Indigenous biodiversity. It's wanting to get involved, to be seen to be involved, and to benefit from being involved. Why? Because the world, throughout the world, there is great concern at the number of species spiralling towards extinction. Ecosystems such as rainforests, wetlands and grasslands degrading and disappearing, the impacts of global warming, and pressures from a burgeoning population on nature's services such as freshwater and fish stocks. That is causing consumers to increasingly demand goods and services that are environmentally friendly. They want to see evidence that the environmental impacts of the production chain are being accounted for. They are punishing those who ignore the demands and rewarding those who meet or exceed them. Consumer sentiment may at times buck the science, but with science as the rock and consumer sentiment as the cement, the concrete is setting. The trend towards greater transparency and accountability for environmental impacts is unstoppable. Ignorance of environmental impacts is no longer business bliss because consumers are no longer prepared to tolerate it. The logic of the case is simple. The state of our indigenous biodiversity is a strong indicator of the health of our ecosystems. The health of our ecosystems determines the quality and quantity of services that nature is able to provide and on which we rely for our economic, social, emotional, cultural and spiritual well-being. And the quantity and quality of the natural capital determines how prosperous we are. There is a direct link between trashing the environment and poverty. You don't need to be a green radical to get that we have to live in harmony with nature to survive and thrive. That creates the business case that conservation and commerce can work in partnership for mutual benefit. Traditionally, we have been at loggerheads. Conservation has been a battlefield of isolated causes. We win some and lose some, and in the event, protect and preserve some representative places and iconic species for New Zealanders and tourists alike to enjoy. That's fine if you like your conservation in formaldehyde. But the condition of our biodiversity is critical to our prosperity. And if that's the case, then conservation is a critical part of how we manage our natural resources to survive and thrive. That creates an ethical imperative for conservationists to achieve far more than protect some zoos to exhibit a bygone world. Facing up to that challenge has, for DOC, meant looking beyond ourselves and our own resources to achieve what needs to be achieved. That has drawn us towards a partnership model with business, local government, iwi, and community groups. It is a huge challenge to our traditional mindset, the way we have operated and the skills and approaches that we value. The road away from a standalone approach to public-private partnerships is not a smooth one. And one of the roadblocks is economic orthodoxy. Economic orthodoxy says to be environmentally healthy, a country needs to first be economically wealthy, when we know the opposite is the case. Economic orthodoxy treats spending on a healthy environment as discretionary, as a nice to have when the economy allows rather than a necessary investment in sustainable growth. It discounts the environmental costs of business, effectively countenances environmental subsidies, and builds up environmental debt for future generations. As the future catches up with us, that environmental debt burden becomes harder to ignore. That's why consumers are becoming active, businesses responding, and governments across the world are being forced to rethink. The issue is global, and in that context, it is easy to dismiss anything a small country and a small economy like New Zealand's can do to make a difference. But that is to deny the power of leadership. Surely an isolated nation with a unique biodiversity, a sense of identity tied to the land, the fourth largest exclusive economic zone in the world, a clean green brand and a pride in calling itself Kiwis, is well placed to show that leadership and benefit from it. Is it any coincidence that native birds have appeared on all New Zealand banknotes since the first one was issued in 1934? That feels to me like a powerful symbol that our financial fortunes and the state of our biodiversity are inextricably linked. It is time that showed up in the nation's accounting system.
E ngā tāna e ngā wāhine e tau nei tēnā koutou katoa. Ka tino iti taku mōhio o te reo Māori, engari ka tino nui taku mihi ki tēnei tonga o enei motu. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. The session is about natural resource use and management. And the first point I want us to consider is that most of New Zealand's land use and other natural resources are managed by private owners, making their own individual and collective decisions separately. These decisions are made within a wider context of national and international legal frameworks and local community values, of course. But the fundamental point is that the decision makers are decentralised. Now that immediately raises issues for scientists. When I hear people say, we as a country are investing too much in, we as a country are ignoring too much of, I immediately think you are ducking the big issue. We don't have the power to tell 4 million people this is what you will do as part of our grand national vision. Instead, our science has to be relevant to these wide array of diverse decision makers, and it needs to be transferred to people who will benefit from the work we do. And this brings us immediately to two of the big themes that came up this morning, the two big C's. Connectedness and communication. We need to be connected to be relevant. We need to communicate if our work is to be transferred to people who will benefit from it. We have a good model for this, I think, in New Zealand, and that is the way the Resource Management Act talks about kaitiakitanga, another concept that came up this morning. The Act defines kaitiakitanga as the exercise of guardianship by the tangata whenua. It's not saying that Māori cultural values should be incorporated in local authority decision making. It says local authorities must allow tangata whenua to exercise kaitiakitanga. Similarly, our research, if it is to be relevant and to make a difference, must empower decision makers to exercise kaitiakitanga in their particular context according to their own particular lights. So this immediately brings us to another of the key themes that came out this morning, and that's the idea of ecosystems of innovation and ecosystems of skills training. The innovation ecosystems ensures that our research is relevant and transferred. The skills training ecosystems ensures that people continue to learn how to use and take advantage of the benefits produced by the new science that is taking place. And of course, this is why tertiary education institutions are so critical in our wider scientific system, because it brings together the innovation systems and the skills training systems. I don't agree that 7 universities and 3 wānanga are too few. I think given the geographical spread of the country and the communities we are serving, we need that level of investment in regional ecosystems of innovation and skills training. Last year, Caroline Saunders and I were privileged to interview 70 key stakeholders about Lincoln University. And so a lot of questions about resource use and management came up. And I want to leave you with 2 key messages that came out of that exercise. First, the stakeholders talked again and again about the importance of transdisciplinary work and the importance not only in our research but in our education of breaking down the silos between science, business and environmental policy. And even in a small specialist land-based institution like Lincoln University, breaking down those silos is enormously difficult. We had a proposal that came out of these interviews of a first-year paper that had the best teacher from the Commerce faculty, the best teacher from the environmental faculty, the best teacher from the land-based sciences faculty, and they would teach a 3rd year of a compulsory course on sustainability. And the idea being that students would learn the language of each other, of those disciplines, and be able to participate in conversations about economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being. And it's proving enormously hard to overcome the barriers of, we already have 7 compulsory subjects in our first year commerce program. There's no room for a program on sustainability in our first year. etc., etc., etc. But the message we got back is this is our future. It's integration is our future. Bringing together the best from all of those disciplines is our future. The second piece of feedback we received goes back to my first point, that we must engage with the enormous variety of individual and collective decision makers spread over the whole country in their specific areas to make progress. This means if we're to engage with these decision makers, we must become much more skilled at identifying and communicating value propositions, of explaining to people why, in their own interests, this is a sensible thing to do. By value propositions, I don't mean generic promises of if you invest in science, we will be more prosperous as a country. I mean multifaceted, detailed, evidence-based explanations of how social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being will be enhanced by specific strategic investments. These are well illustrated by Al Morrison's examples of partnerships between doc and business. Those were value propositions sold to businesses. Indeed, I would call it economic orthodoxy, what he did there. I think we need to be much better at this task as part of the way forward of ensuring science contributes to the prosperity of our country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris Mace, our last speaker. As he finishes, I'd really like to have some of the younger people from the audience to come forward and ask some questions. You can decide for yourself whether you're in that category. I'm not going to judge. But what I'd really like you to do is think about some questions for this panel which you might pose from the perspective of a child living in this country in 20 years' time about our environment. Thank you. Chris.
Kia ora. Tēnā rā koutou katoa. Right now, and as a nation, we have some extremely important decisions to make around the use and management of our precious natural resources. New Zealand's economic well-being continues to depend primarily on our environmental and our natural resources. A major challenge is how we capitalise on these attributes to improve, and I was going to say GDP, but I'll say the well-being and prosperity per capita. However, this is a major subject on its own, and this afternoon, as I'm not a scientist, I will focus on several aspects relating to the crucial role that science plays in the management of our natural resources, and more from a strategic perspective. The themes of this conference, Lifting Our Horizon and New Zealand's Future, Science and the Economy, bring into focus the challenge we face as a nation in the light of the global economic crisis and the national disasters, and how we must now make the most of our vast natural resources in a safe, sustainable and value-adding way. It's hardly surprising that the government is looking to increase the use of these resources to assist our economic recovery. I think this is not only prudent, it is essential. Science and research has a vital role to play in responding to this challenge. Sir Peter Gluckman has described science as an interactive process by which the validity or otherwise of knowledge about the natural world and the universe is established. It is important that we develop our understanding regarding the impacts of resource exploitation, of environmental degradation, food and water security, and the like, and developing our knowledge to assist with managing these challenges from a governance perspective requires a careful utilisation of expert capability, of technology, and of funding. Again from Sir Peter, Lord Porter, a former president of the Royal Society, said there are two types of research: applied research and not yet applied research. From a governance perspective, science strategy must carefully balance these aspects to enhance and test our understandings and to develop new knowledge. As has already been discussed, New Zealand's core brand is built around a clean, green image. Last year, the tourism industry contributed $20 billion plus to the New Zealand economy and supporting nearly 10% of the jobs. Historically, we have not looked after our natural taonga well. The degradation of some of our most precious natural resources, our forests, our lakes and rivers, our coasts and oceans hold testament to this. But in spite of that, New Zealand is far better off than most other countries, and we certainly have the opportunity to do better in the future. The key is how we balance our competing needs, the economic imperatives against the environmental and social consequences. In my view, we must set aside limiting beliefs and base our decision-making on the use and management of our resources, not on short-term expediency, but on knowledge. Knowledge that addresses the intimately entwined linkages between economic prosperity, social development, and environmental protection. This is where science and research and technology become vital tools. As Sir Peter Gluckman has said on many occasions, science creates the platform for effective strategies and wise policy development. I wholeheartedly agree. We must use science's interactive processes of observation, experimentation, and concept formation to better understand our natural world and then apply that knowledge to managing it. We must build strong, integrated environmental policies grounded on evidence, not supposition. We must use science to help monitor and evaluate our decisions. We must not see science solely as the solution to mitigate past mistakes and the legacy impacts of exploitation. The formation of policy that better applies evidence-based knowledge and research is more relevant than ever in today's world, and if we are to avoid the mistakes of the past and the costly consequences. A challenge for the science sector is to effectively the effective transfer of knowledge into the process of policy and regulatory development. Environmental impact assessments, resource evaluation, and risk management demand a strong and functional relationship between science, regulatory authorities, and industry. We also need to get smarter about communicating facts to the wider community. Science has an important role to play as a respected and independent voice in the fierce and fiery debates around how our resources are utilised and managed. Science should be objective and unbiased and steer away from being adversarial, although that does not mean we shouldn't engage in the dialogue. Communicating what we know leads to greater public understanding, informed debate, potential options and solutions. We must share our collective knowledge. At NIWA, collaboration with other organisations, universities, other CRIs, and research entities, industry, iwi, government, and regional councils, and international agencies is fundamental to our work. As a small nation, we must pull together the best possible teams to answer the key environmental issues we face as a nation. So in summary, I believe it is essential that we optimise the use of our natural resources, but not based on short-term expediency. Our challenge is to balance our economic prosperity, our social development, and environmental protection for the benefit of future generations. Independent, objective, and unbiased science must be the basis of decision-making. To quote the Blake Leadership Medalist Sir Paul Callaghan, the founder of this forum, science is the compass on the voyage into the 21st century. Science has been fundamental to the development and prosperity of our country up to this point and must continue to influence our future prosperity for the well-being of all New Zealanders. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm pleased to report that while we were sitting here talking about whether we should use GDP as an indicator or not, New Zealand has upped the rankings from number 6 to number 5 in the happiness stakes, because we've all agreed that we should supplement GDP with some other measures. And as Al Morrison points out, we are now ahead of Australia. That's because we're happy we're not Australia, but Australia is not happy it is not New Zealand. So here we are. Please, first question.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to the speakers. As a young New Zealander, it is a great privilege to be here and hear your words. My name is Ross Dennis McLeish, and I am a student of philosophy and ecology at Victoria University. It is an honour to be surrounded by so many of New Zealand's top thinkers and leaders, so please forgive my nervousness as I humbly offer my voice as a voice for the generation who will inherit the effects of your generation's decisions. I would like to echo much of what has been said. The kaupapa of this conference is to discuss the role science can play in shaping Aotearoa's future. So it is a shame there are so few young adults to share their ears and their thoughts with the wider community. The horizons of my generation extend into a future of uncertainty. As a species, we are abusing the resources of our local and global environment at an irresponsible and accelerating rate. We face the frightening prospect of runaway climate change, continued soil degradation, deforestation, toxin accumulation, and food and water shortages as the population continues to swell and the ability for the earth to provide diminishes. My generation must learn how to come back into balance with the natural world and align our way of life in accord with the systems that provide, the systems that our race is intimately interwoven with. We are all responsible for our actions. As individuals, we work for the security of ourselves and our families. As communities, we work for the strength of our nation. And as a nation, we should work towards the security and prosperity of the earth and its people. This means true prosperity. True prosperity is healthy land and healthy people in healthy relationship. A culture of diversity and tolerance that provides for the collective fulfillment of intellectual, emotional, and spiritual needs. This wealth cannot come at the expense of our own health as a culture and the health of the environment. For this is the only real wealth that we ourselves inherit from our ancestors and pass on to future generations. There is no time to beat around the bush. We must tackle these issues now. Science and innovative thinking has an important role to play. To flourish as a small nation, we must be smart, creative, and sustainable. Our strength lies not in low-value export at the expense of our environment, the health of our people, or our way of life, but in transforming the resources that the land provides in creative and responsible ways as we contribute to the safety and stability of the global social system. Science must continue to work in maintaining and improving the state of our natural heritage, and most importantly, it must form and inspire our society to live in harmony with nature. As Sir Paul Callaghan said, we have to take charge. We're having an impact on the planet. If we are to survive, we must do that. My generation will be inheriting the impact of our resource use. I question the logic that producing more food will feed the increasing population, as food availability is directly related to population numbers. A finite system cannot grow, it can only transform. Some serious rethinking is needed. New Zealand's finite resources cannot grow, but we can transform them into more valuable products in a sustainable way. The benefit of the parts, be they individuals or countries, cannot come at the expense of the health of the whole. We are in this together, inseparably. Ultimately, it's not us or the environment. We are the environment in human form. In the name of my generation and the unborn inheritors of this earth, I call on all of us to take responsibility in our personal lives and our interactions with the world. We must use scientific inquiry and technological development in a deeply responsible and forward-thinking way for true prosperity of a sustainable Aotearoa. The change lies in us. We must change the attitude of exploitation to one of preservation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you. That was an excellent perspective from I suspect, one of the young members in the audience. And I think one of the things I talked about earlier was that we've actually got no lack of ideas about how to solve these challenges. What we have is a lack of leadership, and so I think we're in good shape for the future with that sort of leadership. So let's keep the dialogue going. And next comment, question.
Hi, David McNamara from GNS Science. Just gathering a few comments from what the panel were discussing. To manage our resources, we need better knowledge of these resources, and to do that effectively, it seems to be that there's a lot of talk about breaking out of disciplinary silos and silos across different institutes, etc. What I want to ask the panel is, how well do you think the New Zealand institutes and government and etc. are preparing the next generation of science and the current generations of emerging career scientists to do this?
Panel. Chris, you look like they've got the answer there.
I think it's a big issue. I know it's a big issue. I mean, one of the problems that we have under the current economic conditions that we find ourselves working in is that we can deliver what we need to deliver today and probably next year. But where are the apprentices coming through to take over the specialist expertise that is currently providing the skill set to do the work? And I know it's an issue that a lot of our senior scientists talk to me about, that while they may have adequate funding to deal with their day-to-day activities, that they feel that there isn't the emphasis going on the replacements, the specialist replacements. So it's something that hopefully, as we start to come through this economic crisis, we'll be able to put more and more emphasis on. I think that the tertiary sector is getting far better aligned with the requirements of the nation as far as skills are concerned. It's not just all about producing accountants and lawyers anymore. We are seeing a growing increase in interest in the sciences, but then again, it's up to all of us that perhaps work in this sector to try and encourage youngsters that there is a career for them in sciences, and then to align them with some of our national treasures, the scientists that have the specialist expertise, so they can develop the passion and go forward and make a contribution. Very important point.
Can I maybe add something as well? I joined the DSIR over 30 years ago, and at that time it was a bit like the iron rice bowl concept. You know, you joined science, you had a career for life if you wanted to. There was no real planning of careers as such. You know, you joined and you did science, and it was research and it was fun. Today, I think we're much more aware. I'm at GNS Science, I speak for our institution. We're much more aware that science is a global commodity, like other things as well. I mean, you're a classic example. That today we look around the world for expertise, and this is the same for New Zealanders. They look around the world for jobs as well. And I think as a consequence, our organizations, I suspect other organizations, are aware of the fact that we need to do a better job about looking after staff, looking after their interests and their resources, and trying to maximize the benefits that they offer for the institution and what the institution can offer for them. So I think there has been a big change. I think that the institutions are trying to do better for junior staff and giving them opportunities and trying to develop their careers.
Can I just add an extra dimension, partly in defense of producing more accountants and lawyers? At the moment, and economists, at the moment the university system is incentivized to do that, to subsidize science within the institution. If you didn't have this number of lawyers and other students out there, science would get even less from the tertiary system. So, you know, we're not the problem here. You know, we've been supporting you for many, many years because we have this crazy funding model. It's a bums on seats model, and we have to turn those bums on seats round, and we get very, very little by way of research dollars that go back into the institution to do the research that we have to do. So again, you know, economists know about incentives, and VCs know about incentives that have been created by this craziness. And we have an even crazier system now, which says that the Tertiary Education Commission and the rest want to control price and quantity. They want to give us a quota, and they want to cap the price. As economists, we know it doesn't work that way. And if we took the price cap off and let institutions who are better than other institutions charge higher fees to get people through, we would probably have fewer economists trained because the institutions would have more dollars to give to the scientists. So it's not quite as simple as that. One other thing while I've got the mic is that we didn't discuss this issue about funding science, and I think this is a crucially important thing that we haven't talked about. If we look at Marsden with $55 million and we look at MSI with $650 million, economics and social research dollars that are available are minuscule in terms of what's available from that. So we have quite a big pot that we could allocate differently if we chose to do so. It's not about just getting more dollars into the system. And if you want to be serious about doing serious economics and serious social and serious environmental, you have to allow those people to bid into, not to go into tenders, which is what MSI want, but to do some more blow skies work. So,
Stephen, you...
little to add to that. I agree with everything the panel said. One point, though, I don't think New Zealand should get lulled into a sense of security knowing that science is a highly mobile area. We can't necessarily bring the scientists in for environment that we need from overseas. To some extent we can, but not completely. Some of the complex environmental research we do really does demand people who have worked and lived here and trained here. And I think that should be a warning that I believe that I've heard over the years, well, it's fine, it's highly mobile, we get good people coming in and we lose people going out. Yeah, but it doesn't work for in-depth environmental research.
Okay, that's good.
I just want to add a perspective to this. I think it's a really good question, and I'm hearing lots of answers to a question that's kind of cast, what can we do for scientists to encourage science and so on? It's all good stuff. I think it was John F. Kennedy who said, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for your nation. So I think there's an equally relevant question about what can scientists do? And I think we've been hearing some of the answers this morning, and they certainly resonate for me. More of my previous life as a journalist trying to be a science reporter and giving up. Scientists, by my experience, are appalling communicators. They don't like socialising their work, and they're very precious about their information. And they've got to do something about that, because the big word I've heard here this morning is make the science relevant. So that's the bit that you can do.
I'll just take one more from here, and then I can see that Peter's broken the instructions, and now the questions are open to everybody in the room.
Okay, so I'm here again from Ponomu with a question from somewhere in New Zealand, so I cannot verify how old the people who are asking the questions are. But something which is coming up in this game is we ask people to think about how would New Zealand be in 2022 with a population that are scientifically able, and they're able to use science as much as we are able to use computers and things like that now. And during the game, people can post and they can make comments back and forward with each other, and we decide whether or not things are super interesting. And something which keeps coming up in this idea of resources are New Zealand's waterways. And one thing which is coming up is, we already have the technology, in relation to dairy farming in particular, we already have the technology to make the waterways cleaner. Why is New Zealand not leading the world in this area?
This is where we need Grant Edwards, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Grant couldn't be here to answer that question, but someone else give it a go.
Look, the first thing to say is that the industry is aware of the commercial advantage that would be gained if we were recognised as the world leaders in this space. You might have heard of the Clean Streams Accord as one part of the market would see that that's a way of deflecting criticism of what has been achieved so far and hasn't been very effective. Another segment would say this was a first step to try and garner the individual decision makers' support for the necessity to implement the technologies that involve costs, that involve opportunity costs and foregone opportunities, and as a way of starting to talk about the benefits that would be gained if there was widespread adoption. But everybody agrees, I think, that the Clean Streams Accord has succeeded in every aspect except the effluent discharges one, which is the critical one. And so it is only a first step.
Okay. We'll take another question here. Yeah. Next.
Working. Kia ora koutou, my name's Malua Watson. I'm here from Reykjavik and I live in Gisborne. You asked for some sort of, looking ahead a little bit. I've got two small girls and I've got a question on behalf of them. Earlier in this discussion, the vast economic potential of offshore oil and gas exploration was alluded to. Do you think that there's an ethical onus on the scientific community to ask the question, just because it's there, is it right that we tap it, knowing what we know about climate change?
Boy, that's a great question, and it's one that's loaded across not just oil exploration, but a lot of different areas of scientific endeavour, isn't it? Ray, I think.
I guess my point. We talked about this a little bit earlier. I think, and what you're sort of asking in a way is it's a value judgment, and that's not something that I, as a scientist, want to address. I want to talk about the opportunities that New Zealand has, that we can then discuss and say, okay, as a society, do we want to invest in oil exploration and possibly get the benefits that might come to New Zealand, and take the associated risks and costs and so on. But I want to have an informed discussion about that based upon what we know about the resources. I mean, I'd also want to point out that sort of the flip side of this to me is that as a society we're quite happy to import goods, Toyotas and so on, but we have to be very careful that we don't export all our environmental costs overseas. If we're importing Toyotas and that's made from steel from Africa, which has an impact on the African environment, I mean, that is a moral decision we make. And I'm sitting here as a geologist thinking, okay, if we have resources that we can develop perhaps more environmentally responsibly than the rest of the world, it's a moral dilemma for me in a way. I mean, I totally agree that there are lots of reasons why you might want to do it, but there's a moral dimension as well that we have to look at it in a broader picture.
The contribution science can make is to estimate the risk. Our job is to estimate the risk of extraction, explain it properly and publicly, and then for the community itself, through the political process, to make the decision. We're not arbiters of whether we do something or not.
Right, okay, thank you. So Peter.
There's an elephant in the room which has just been alluded to, and it came up in Charles Royal's presentation at the end of the last session, and it came up in Chris Mace's discussion now, and it's just come up in this last dialogue, and it's the difficult one. It's the one about perception of risk and management of risk. Here we've got a situation where I thought we'd have more discussion about it in this panel, that we have got a situation where we are likely to be rich in natural resources in difficult places. We are rich in the potential to make more food, which the world needs. We either have to double the amount of land in the world that's used for food production, or we have to double the amount of food produced per hectare of land over the next 20 years if the world is to continue, if food crisis is not to emerge more rapidly. And yet in New Zealand, discussion about risk has largely been emotive and political rather than rational and information based on which other domains are based. If you go back 10 years to the GM debate, it was a very immature debate compared to what it could have been. Whatever the outcome was, that's a values and appropriate judgment for the political process to make. And I think we are struggling, and we're going to struggle more in the next while to see how the trade-offs, whatever term economists want us to use, between resource management and what we do with the environment, what we do with our resources for commercial use, etc., etc., is going to be managed against a knowledge base, against a belief base, which is not always rational, and there are multiple belief bases around, and a political process which sometimes misuses this stuff for other reasons. And I just wondered whether there's a way we can get to a more mature national conversation about risk.
Can I just add to that? I think the risk issue is really interesting right now, isn't it? Because we've got this whole debate in another risk context, which is what we do about our buildings and our structures as a result of the Christchurch earthquake. And I just want to illustrate the risk point maybe with a little story, a very quick one. We had a client who had a building in the Wairarapa that members of the public came to that building for meetings. They closed the building because it had an earthquake risk. They sent the people that came to that building for meetings to their head office in Wellington for the same meeting. It would otherwise have been held in the Wairarapa. And what they didn't realise is that the risk they were putting those people through for driving over the Wairarapa hill was 1,000-fold the risk they would have had if they'd been in that building. So we react quite intuitively, and I guess that's the human nature, isn't it? We react instinctively to risk, but we don't actually stop and really think about it. And Les talked a little bit about opportunity cost. It's kind of the same thing, isn't it? We've closed off one risk, but we've actually, in not doing that thing, we've created perhaps a bigger risk.
Can I just answer Sir Peter on one issue? If you look carefully at the innovation literature coming out of economics, the key reason why economists talk about innovation is reducing uncertainty for firms and businesses into the future. If you innovate, you reduce the uncertainty that in an uncertain world compared to those that don't innovate. The other issue I'll talk about is risk, because economists and social scientists differentiate between risk and uncertainty. And I'll just make a little plug here, which is not trying to score points, but when we looked at the risk of the next financial crisis that's post-1987, we engaged a lot of maybe second-rate physicists as economists, and they told us that the probability of a crash as big as 1987 was 3 times the age of the universe. Because their models were based upon normal distributions and very low probabilities of occurrence. So, yes, I agree that we have to do some risk modelling, but we have to do it in a very, very careful way.
I'm not even arguing with risk modelling. It may be that it's the nature of the discussion that has to be different. I mean, as I said earlier today, I'm not convinced that mathematical descriptions of risk have a lot of relevance to the way in which a community perceives risk, and I think there's a very different dialogue that we have to achieve. What I am concerned about is the misuse of so-called science in the national conversation which has occurred from time to time, Frankenfoods or whatever other example you want to use. We need to get to a better discussion so a participatory democracy can have a better can come to conclusions based on what we know and what we don't know.
I hesitate to say this because I'm going to get into trouble, but this is a key question about how we make decisions in this country. My experience is that there is good science-based information to input into good decision making. The thing that gets in the way are planners. This country is planned from top to bottom, all over the place. They cross each other, they parallel each other, they get in the way. You get 10-year plans that try and look 10 years ahead and deny 10 years of information. And you get the information and say, here's a good decision, and someone says, you can't do it. Section 6.31 says, and you're stuffed. And we've got to deal with this issue of high-level planning that retains the flexibility to get that information there. I've seen time and again good information, and people will tell you, well, you can't consider that. And you say, why not? I say, because the process doesn't let you, and the plan disallows it.
I'm a planner, Al, and I couldn't agree with you anymore. You did right, and in fact, the planning fraternity in New Zealand focuses far too much on process and far too little on outcomes, and I think that's really what you're saying, and we've got to find better ways of getting around those processes, so I agree with you entirely.
Could you promise not to tell anyone at DOC that I said that?
You promised not to tell anyone on my phone, that's
right? Okay, so everybody should know me, but I'm Kate McGrath, Director of the McDiarmid Institute. I have a multifaceted question that picks up on risk and diversity and risk mitigation, as well as also being able to ensure that we maintain options open to us. So all of you, I hope, in the room knows about the catastrophe that has recently happened in New Zealand in the kiwi fruit industry and the reduction of the genetic diversity in our kiwi fruit, which has meant that it has been susceptible to pests, and that as such many of the kiwi fruit farms have been decimated. So it builds on the, I can't remember now who said it, sorry, about how biodiverse our ecosystem is here in New Zealand. And then someone went on to talk about how our educational basis should be also diverse across the demographics of New Zealand. So my question essentially is, how do we look at risk mitigation while keeping opportunities open and diversity as broad as we possibly can?
Stephen, do you want
to? There's some things we have to do. We have to trade, and we have to grow kiwi fruit, really, in order to trade. So the deal is, I believe, that we have to, with those corollaries, we really have to understand the threats, and if you like, offset the threats through research. So you do research into the threats, and then you research how you go to offset those threats when they finally emerge. And I think that's research. And I think it's, if you talk about the lack of genetic diversity of our crops, you're quite right, but we're kind of stuck with it because we also have to maintain, if you like, environmentally acceptable rates of production. If we lose levels of productivity, we'll be bringing in more land. And so there are trade-offs all over the place. But it's, what I was talking about biosecurity really was about risk management based on very good information and very good responses to failure when these failures occur.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. Wendy.
Hi. I think that comment in regard to a national conversation is really relevant. And I was really interested in the instruments, both in regard to the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification and in regard to what we're trying to do here. And I must say I get concerned when there's a discussion about whether there has been a mature or immature discussion, and particularly Peter's comment, because I actually think that if you're going to use those rather derogatory terms, you need to explain what a mature one would look like. I think the Royal Commission was a brilliant vehicle for trying to have a national conversation, and I actually think that the commissioners actually did a really good job. And I think that although people know me, I've written a report on all the recommendations, and they haven't always been implemented, but at least it gave a vehicle or a process to channel that. And I sort of see the issues like that you've raised in regard to the building, obviously mining, and the drilling, are issues that are very much at this magical interface between science and society. And I think that in order to have that conversation, we need to move forward into a more positive dialogue around those tools. So I just make that point. And I just don't know if anyone wants to comment on Royal Commissions, or is there other tools or mechanisms that you think that could progress national conversations in New Zealand? Could we repeat this? Could we do something better? I just put it to the panel. Thanks.
Look, it's a real issue about how you create public forums for informed dialogue, and the Royal Commission is one way. We've had the Welfare Working Group recently, that there was lots of public submissions that were henpicked really to get quotable quotes to support a particular line of argument. In my view, I should admit I was a member of the Alternative Welfare Working Group, and I think one of the skills that limits our ability to have these public debates is that we very quickly polarize things into immature, mature, into risk-free certainty to bring disaster. And we're not so skilled at synthesizing different points of view into a balanced assessment of where the weight of wisdom is leading us. And one of the reasons we don't have that, I think, is because we don't have good public forums other than a TV set with two opposing voices speaking at each other. And, you know, Kim Hill was here before. I mean, the morning report is often two voices saying opposite things, and there's no real opportunity for recognizing the depth of your concern, the strength of your opportunity. Can we find a win-win where your concerns are addressed and managed and your opportunities are not limited beyond what is necessary to meet those concerns? And I think MMP was supposed to bring that about, and it hasn't really. And so in some jurisdictions, it would be the independent institutes, the Institute of Public Policy, the Institute of Policy Studies, the McDiarmid Institute, et cetera, that would host these sorts of public forums where that sort of informed dialogue could be brought to a consensus. And we don't have the funding for that sort of independent forum that I think could be a big contribution to informed public debate.
Stephen, and then we'll go to the next question. Sure. You're the boss.
In Europe, there have been experiments called hybrid forums. They've been very, particularly in France, they've been used of trying to maintain on issues such as nuclear power is the major example in France where it was used to deal with nuclear waste and so forth. Extensive public dialogue between the science community and the community. Highly effective at getting an understanding of both sides, and very expensive to run, very complicated to run, but I think in many ways more effective than some judicial body opining a solution for all time, which is effectively the difficulties with the Commission approaches. You need to understand technologies change and understandings of technologies change. And I think when you have hybrid forums of the kind that the French use, you do bring the community along and to understand the nuances rather than the black and white of a situation.
Thanks, Stephen.
Let's just acknowledge before we finish this that the Land and Water Forum, which is a very good example of what Sir Peter's talking about, and is an attempt in New Zealand to try this. And I think it would be worth you looking at both the process and the product that's coming out of it. It's a really, really interesting thing that's going on.
A sure sign of a mature process to me is capture of partial information by lobby groups that use science cynically.
But it's almost time, folks, and so we've got a question here. There's two more guys behind you. Let's see how we go. Yeah, Peter just used up a couple of the last 2 minutes, so I reckon we might go 2 minutes over.
Let's have all three together.
Three was
questions.
Three.
One, and then we'll respond to
Okay, let's
go. Kia ora, Christian Schott from Victoria University. My first strong suggestion is to move the microphone out of the way of the camera, because that's been proving challenging. I've really enjoyed the discussions that we've been having so far, and I thought it was brilliant to highlight that language issue and the issue of communication between the sciences and business and sciences and the communities. What I thought might have been lacking up until now, and this is probably not quite rightly placed at this panel, but is that we've completely cut out the people that actually pay us to get them educated, which is the students. And we haven't talked about how science contributes to education and what roles we play as hard sciences, social sciences, whatever we might be, in educating the students. We take it for granted, but the point I'm trying to make is that I think we've also lost touch of the language the students speak in learning terms and the languages that we might speak, most of us being old school, and I would even count myself into that, even though I might still be on the cusp, and I like to try to be more in touch with what the students are feeling, but they live in a different world. They grew up in a different world, and I think we mustn't forget that also. That communication is a very important one, and that we need to appeal to their learning styles, their ability to pick up on the type of information and knowledge that we're trying to depart, and that they need to turn that into learning and not just information they jot down. So I realize this is probably not something you might like to comment on, but it's, I think, something that we need to put out there because it hasn't yet been put out there. Thanks.
Okay, that's good. That's a great comment. Thanks. And some of these, Gareth, we might hold for your session because they're quite related. So we'll see how we go with time. Well, let's take all the questions and then we'll ask for a final comment from the panel.
Okay. Marcus Wilson from the University of Waikato. Christian's actually sort of half done my question or comment, which is that we've heard a bit about the power really in Aotearoa and New Zealand resting not with big organisations, not with the government, but the power rests with individuals who own their land and in particular own their little tick in the ballot box. And I would suggest that in order to bring science really into fruition in this country, we need to spend a lot more attention in actually engaging the public into understanding what science is, so that science and scientists do not become the enemy or some geek sitting there saying something that people don't understand, but with a science-educated public who appreciate the role of science, then science is actually going to be able to influence real decision-making. It wasn't really a question.
It was a comment, and we'll think that's a great comment there. And finally,
Joe Lane, University of Waikato as well. My comment would really be with regard to the role of media and science, and talking about this idea of an immature debate. And as far as I can tell, an immature debate arises because of advertising dollars and sensationalised media. The media's idea of a balanced scientific argument or debate is to take one person from each side of the position, when in fact you might find that 99% of scientists sit in one position and 1% in the other. I would like to see some sort of, I don't know, legislation not removing, not removing free speech, but forcing forcing the media organisations to be socially responsible, because it is irresponsible to put a sensationalised risk message to the mass. You know, issues like immunisation have just got ridiculously out of control because there is poor information out there, because you don't sell good advertising dollars telling everybody that it's a good idea to immunise your child to avoid diphtheria.
Yes, I quite agree. It's a point well made, and I'm not sure that I agree with the legislation part of it, but certainly there needs to be a better dialogue, doesn't there, in our media. And I think just picking up, I guess trying to wrap up and get to morning tea. Maybe afternoon tea. Jesus, it hasn't gone on that long, has it? Maybe what we need to think about is you know, a couple of comments there. I think my view, interacting with the public a lot as I do on various projects, is the public really does understand science. They really do get it. What scientists don't understand is how to communicate science to the public. So actually that's the dialogue. And one of the things that I've found a really powerful thing, and many of you will have similar experiences, is actually we need to do that through storytelling. Not through graphs and facts and that sort of thing, but through storytelling. We've got a great history in this country of telling stories, and so we should use that. We should use that much more in terms of our dialogue on science. So thanks very much to the panel. Thanks very much for the discussion. It's been really, it's been good. It's been controversial from time to time, and that's been really good. And look forward to afternoon tea. Thanks very much to the panel. So afternoon tea is over in the tent and back here by 3:30. Thanks.